So much, Ramesh, for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure. Just for the people who are listening in, my name is Abhi. I am the co-founder and CEO of Ocular. We're a retail technology company which helps in automating a number of processes which are quite manual for retailers right now. But today we have Ramesh Karnani joined us. And before we dive into questions, I'll do a quick introduction for Ramesh, who has a very prolific educational and professional background. So this might take a little while, but I'll go through it, and Ramesh, you can tell me where maybe things I missed out. So you did your computer engineering from IIT Bombay. Then you went and did your MBA from University of California, Berkeley. Then with different roles, you started as an investment banker, made your way up to being a managing director in Credit Suisse. Then with different roles, you moved across to Australia, started with BCG as a managing
That's
partner,
right.
managing director and partner there. Then with Port Jackson Partners, which is another consulting firm. Then most recently with uh, with Boral as their chief strategy officer, and then also been involved with number of different startups in advisory and sort of board roles. So did I miss something over there? I'm sure I have.
No, you've done a very good job there, Abhi, and it's my pleasure here to be talking to you. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
No, thanks, Ramesh. No, fantastic. And so with Ramesh, with all these different things and work-wise from investment banking to consulting to working with startups, etc. I know it's difficult to say what you've enjoyed the most, but what elements of this have been most fun, or where have you sort of had the most enjoyment out of these things?
Abhi, what really turns me on is helping people develop and implement value creating strategies, profitable growth strategies. And I see that as consisting of two parts. One is the challenge of coming up with the right solution and the right strategic analytical solution. But the equally challenging and perhaps the more difficult part is convincing senior management and CEOs to change their minds and to change their behaviors to implement the strategy that has been developed jointly with them. And so, what I've really enjoyed in my career to date has been my strategy consulting days, and then more recently, the time that I'm spending nurturing and working with entrepreneurs. But again, because again, when you look at entrepreneurs, they are excellent. They are at their expertise, of their field of expertise, but they're not necessarily great or excellent at running businesses and developing strategies, which is what I like to do. And so there's a good combination of skills going on there.
Absolutely, and that's spot on. Going through my own experience as a startup co-founder, along with my other fellow co-founders, coming up with a strategy is absolutely vital because you've got limited time, effort, and you want to make sure that you spend it wisely and appropriately. And that sort of leads me on to discuss about because you have been in strategy in and out. You've studied that, you've worked and sort of premium consulting firms on that. Sometimes when we think about strategy, people think of just senior people getting into a room, lots of whiteboards, and talking at a very high level. But maybe it'll be fantastic to just help sort of demystify the strategy formulation, or how do you come up with a winning strategy which is appropriate for an organization,
Yeah.
small, medium, large, and any sort of examples would be fantastic in that.
Well, there are a number of good strategy frameworks around, and there are some common elements that I would like to point out here that I hold dear to my heart when developing strategies with my clients or with my business colleagues. And the common elements are following. The first is determining where you're going to play or determining where you're going to participate, what customers are your target customers, and what products and services are you going to provide them. And in today's day and age, I must say that, particularly given social media and the ability to reach different segments of people all across the world, customer segmentation has become far easier and therefore a lot more important. So it's very important to determine, let us say, if you are a retailer, given your business, and your customers are retailers, let us say that you're a retailer of women's apparel. You have a lot of choices. You can be targeting young teenagers, or you could be targeting professional working women, or you could be targeting children. So I think you have to decide what is your sweet spot and what are the products and services you're going to be selling them, and how are those products and services are somewhat unique. Of course, they're not going to be always unique, but they're somewhat different than what's available elsewhere. So deciding what is your sweet spot, both in terms of customers and in terms of products, is step number one. And you have to, in that products and services, you have to figure out what are the customer pain points that you're trying to solve. You have to put yourself in the shoes of your customers and say, this is the problem or I'm going to solve for my clients or for my shoppers in the case of online retailing. The second important element of strategy is figuring out how you're going to win. What is it that's going to make you different than other people? So when I look at Walmart, for example, the way it grew in the 90s is that they said they are going to optimize the supply chain such that they will provide products at the lowest prices or among the lowest prices possible. So they were not sacrificing the quality of the product. What they were saying is that we are going to be so good at managing the merchandising, the inventory, getting on the shelf. And that's how they built their entire business from 1985 to 2000. And then you look at Amazon, it was completely a different strategy, right? I mean, they had this notion that they started out with books and music and so on, but it was more books first. And then they got into other products. And what they said is, we're going to provide you a wide variety, and we're going to carry all this inventory in our warehouse. But because we don't need a storefront, because we have warehouses in the countryside or close to the skirts of regions, our merchandising and inventory costs are going to be lower, and we're going to be able to provide you the products that you want from a very wide variety. So that's what they gave you. So you need to figure out what is it different? How are you going to win against your competitors? And that's element number two. Element number three is, once you know where you're going to play and how you're going to win, then you need to figure out what capabilities you need to win. And in the case of Amazon, for example, one of the capabilities they needed was to put up all these warehouses that are within delivery zones. They're not so far apart that they're going to add a lot of costs. And they have to figure out a whole network of warehouses all around the United States first, and then the rest of the world. But they also put some hubs near Memphis and elsewhere so that they could get through the country within 24 to 48 hours. So you need to figure out what capabilities. Then item number four, I think, is very important. It is, what culture and management processes are you going to have within your company? There is a well-known saying that culture eats breakfast, culture eats strategy for breakfast,
Mm.
meaning that you can have the best strategy ever, but if you don't have the right culture and the right management processes, that strategy may be worth nothing. And having the appropriate culture for your company, determining that, and putting in appropriate management processes is very important. And so, to give an example, um, you know, when FedEx, for example, first started out, Federal Express delivering packages and so on, their culture was not to save costs. That was not important. What was important was reliability. And they made sure, and they advertised the fact that 99.9% of their products reached on time. Reliability was much more important than cost. So if you were shipping an important product or an important document, a legal document, and they charge you $40 and somebody else said, I'll do it for 30, $10 is nothing. If you want to get the package there next day, you want reliability, you're going to pay $15, $20 more if you knew that FedEx was more reliable than someone else. And that's the culture that they grew. They said to their employees, you cannot let a product fall in between the cracks. You cannot let a customer get disappointed because a product, their package did not get delivered on time. So
Mm.
that's what I mean by knowing what's the key elements of your organization and then imbibing that in your culture and paying and rewarding people who follow that and
Mm.
also correcting behaviors that are not consistent with your culture.
Yeah, and that is so critical, right? That you mentioned where will the company play, how will you win, what capabilities you need to win, and then having underline or underpin the whole thing by your culture and to be able to execute that, because the biggest risk is also execution. You come up with this, how do
Yeah.
you actually, the people who are executing it have to be appropriately incentivized as an individual and as a collective group to make sure that they can deliver on those promises in there. And as you mentioned that there is these frameworks, there are examples of who have done it well and how companies, say in the space of retail, like you've got Walmart in the beginning, and then you've got great examples of Amazon. So there is good feedback, good examples out there. But why do companies constantly, more than anything else, get it wrong? Like, why is it that there is those points of failures after having so much collateral in terms of information out there, what to do, we know,
Mhm.
still repeatedly get it wrong?
Yeah. So, yeah, sometimes the strategy is incorrect, right? I mean, you thought the world was going to go one way and you made a bet that way and it didn't go quite that way. But I would say that more often than not, the strategy is a good one. And there has been ample research done on why strategies fail, which I will cite because it's not based on my personal research, but my experience combined with other research. One reason the strategies fail, or the primary reason that strategies fail, is that they're not resourced adequately, that you haven't dedicated appropriate resources either in marketing or in product development or in inventory management, whatever the case may be, which are your underlying drivers of creating value, that you've not resourced it well. And I think people are reluctant to allocate more resources to one area and less to another. They try to, what's the expression, to spread the butter evenly over the bread, and that's not good. You should allocate your best resources to your most critical parts of the business. And you should not be afraid to resource your strategy appropriately, otherwise, it's going to falter. The second reason that has been often cited as why strategies fail is lack of good understanding and communication throughout the company. So senior people know usually what the company's strategy is, but it does take a lot of time and energy for the CEO and the management team to make sure that filters down throughout the organization, right? And once the people in the rank and file understand your strategy, it's also important to discuss with them what can they do to help you in that strategy. So if I take the FedEx example, what can they do to help reliability? What can the delivery driver do to help reliability? Well, one thing is if a package is delivered late, is to let the central quarters know that a package has been delivered late so that somebody can contact the customer and apologize. So
Mm.
yes, there will be times when even FedEx used to go wrong or screw up, so to speak. But the point is, if there was a system in place to take care of that, there were people to take care of that. Or if you look at within the example of FedEx, is that, there are all these planes flying around at night. The pilots have an important role to make sure that they've reliably delivered the product, etc. So if you can make sure that everybody understands your strategy, but more importantly, the one-on-one, not one-on-one, but the many-on-one discussion you have with the different groups of your employees, that they understand their role as to what they can help you in delivering that strategy. I think that is very important.
And the consequence of, and they understand, like in this example, they said the delivery person, the pilot, they understood the consequence of not doing what they were meant to do and the repercussions of that, and then what to do if things didn't go well.
Go well, that's right. I think it's far easier to put down, and I found this in my personal consulting experience, it's far easier to put down a strategy on paper that looks good, that feels good, everybody agrees, and yet 2 years later, the organization is floundering. And another example that I like to share is from my most recent work as the senior strategy officer for Bora Limited, which is a construction cement company. And I know it's not an online retailing, but I thought this example is a good one, which is when I joined the company, they had a wonderful product, a low carbon cement product, but it wasn't selling well. They had it for more than 5 years, and it was only selling 1 to 2%. And part of the issue there was that the product had been mispriced a while back at a very high price. And the customer, which is the construction builders, they were not willing to pay the higher price for a low carbon product. Now, we are all environmentally conscious, etc. But when was the last time that you bought an apartment or you bought a house or you rented an apartment and you were saying, I'm willing to pay another $50 a month because this is built out of low carbon concrete? Well, it turns out that was not a pain point. You see, that's what I meant earlier in my introductory comments about strategy. You need to understand what are the customer's pain points. Everything else being equal, a builder will use low carbon cement, no doubt about it. Everything else being equal, the builder wants to be environmentally conscious. But once you tell the builder this is a 20% premium, they say, well, my customers don't want to pay 20% more for my building, so how can you charge me 20% more? And that's, I think, what's involved here. And it may be that this strategy was premature. It may be that 8, 10 years from now, low carbon cement will command a premium because everybody's willing to pay for environmentally friendly building. But it wasn't true in the last 5 to 8 years. That's what I meant. So
Yeah.
that brings me to one other element, which is why strategies fail, is that strategies are not static. You don't come up with a strategy today and say, okay, I'm done for the next 2 years. Strategy is a dynamic, living thought process. And as a CEO, I would advise all CEOs and senior management teams to have a strategic agenda, to have an agenda of the 3 or 4 things that, from a strategy point of view, they're always thinking about it. And when one issue gets resolved, it gets replaced with another one. And I think that's a very effective way of having a vibrant strategy that is alive over time.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point you touched upon is that you might come up with a winning strategy, but then keeping it relevant, keeping it live in the views of right from a board member down to an intern who's joining
Right.
uh, is being able to communicate. But are there any maybe pragmatic tips on how to keep that relevant? I think you mentioned about the FedEx example, which makes me think that to almost break it down for the individual on the consequence of not maybe all of the strategy doesn't apply to that individual, but there are elements that they can influence in that strategy which can have a big impact on there. So keeping it live, keeping it fresh in the views of every single person in the organization is quite critical. And if there are tips on how to go about doing that, that would be great.
Well, it's not rocket science, so don't get me wrong here. I think you have hit the nail on the head, which is to identify group by group of your employees what's their role in getting the strategy right, and what can they do to help you implement it, and on a day-to-day basis, what their consequences, what their role and responsibilities are.
Mm,
What I've found effective among some of the CEOs I worked with is that they have a town hall meeting every 3 months or every 4 months or every 6 months with their employees, and not necessarily with the whole company. They might have it with their merchandising people. Next time, they might have it with their inventory management and warehousing people. And they talk about the strategy, they talk about what is working well, they
mm.
talk about what is not working well and is on their strategic agenda. And then they break it down for the group that they're talking to and saying, this is how you and merchandising can help us. If you have ideas along this dimension and that dimension, come back to me and I will be listening to you.
That's right. Getting input, yeah, and that's always relevant. That when people feel there is more buy-in because they've had input into that strategy, they don't feel that it has just been top down on, barked on them or told that, okay, look, this is what we're doing and this is the way, but it's almost getting the relevant input from people across the organization, and so that they feel that they have contributed in building that up as well.
Yeah.
Wow. Also, talking about strategy, the brand becomes very important. The brand that you stand for, because obviously, ultimately, companies and brands are choosing a position and they're saying the strategy should be allowing them to achieve that brand. But now, with a crowded marketplace, we know we can't differentiate purely on price in the retail world because, how do you compete with the likes of Walmart and Amazon if you're competing on price? So there is other, you differentiate yourselves from customer experience or delivery or different things. But how should, say, a retailer in this sort of crowded marketplace stand
Mhm.
out? What could they be doing to give themselves a bit of that edge?
Well, I think if I could, and a lot of this I think is self-evident, but is not necessarily being followed all the time by every wonderful retailer. And I think starting with the products, you have to ask yourself, how are your products different from other products? And is there anything unique? Maybe if you are a retailer of socks and bamboo is becoming a bigger and bigger part of the fabric that people are wearing socks out of. Maybe you differentiate yourself. There'll be other bamboo socks manufacturers and sellers, but nevertheless, not the whole world has moved there, right? So you're looking at your products, or your products could be seasonal, and you could have summer clothing that is very flowery and so on, and you could be known for that. So, you have to decide what is it that you bring to the table. You could be bringing, a flair for formal dresses, and that's where your competitive advantage is, that you can visualize and you can be selling these wonderful formal women's clothing, for example. So I think number one is deciding how is your product at least quite a bit different than everyone else's. There might be two or three other people that are similar, but at least it's different than 90% of the products available on there. The second thing with particularly this transformation started with COVID. I think there is ample work press written about how digitization has taken off and how the world of becoming digital has been accelerated by 5 years. So things that we imagined to happen 4 or 5 years from now have happened in the last 18 months. I mean, by all of many of us staying at home, etc., shopping from online shopping has taken off, and therefore online retailers as well as brick and mortar retailers have had to become smarter online retailers, adopting digital technology and now going into artificial intelligence and machine learning. So I think it's important for retailers to research all the new tools that have become available in the last 2 years. To me, it's mind-boggling how much the world has moved in the last 2 years in this world of digital technology. The
Mm,
third is a buzzword, but I'll use it nevertheless, is customer journey. I think you have to put yourself in the shoes of the customers and see if they're getting a wonderful experience and a wonderful journey on your website. You know, go through the whole process of doing comparisons, doing visual searches, doing when they do a search, do they get a robust answer? Do they get all the nice details that they're looking for? Then the checkout process, and then the process of returning the product if they don't like it. So you got to think of the whole chain all the way up to the end, and then getting a review from the customer. You got to monitor that whole thing and ask yourself, is this a pretty seamless from the search all the way to getting a customer review? Is it a friendly, customer friendly process or not? I
Yeah.
would say they are the most, and some people's site also make sure that you are got all the fast moving products in stock and so on. But that's your bread and butter of retailing, so I won't go there. But these are the two or three things to me that stand out for becoming or for winning in online retailing.
Yeah, and I think that's a critical, isn't it? If I summarize what he's saying is getting that some of it is foundational, some of it is not,
Yeah.
just not to differentiate. It is you have to have those. It's expected now. It might have been differentiated maybe say 18 months ago, but things have changed so rapidly that the customer is just demanding that. They're expecting that, and the retailer might be thinking it's not quite required, but the expectations have moved quite a bit in the mind of the user. So some of that becomes foundational, and making sure if there's a fatal flaw in the process that is fixed immediately. And then on top of that, building your uniqueness. Where are your strengths, and then playing to those strengths and building. So I think that's I think as you mentioned, it's important to be able to differentiate between is it a fatal flaw and a foundational thing which needs to be done, and then building on uniqueness and playing to strengths on top of that. Mm, yeah.
Absolutely right on. So I think there is a lot of room for online retailers to do very well, but I don't think most online retailers can be everything to everybody. To me, strategy is as important about deciding what you're going to do as deciding as to what you're not going to do. What are the trade-offs you're willing to make? If there was no trade-off, then there is no need for strategy. It'd be a wonderful business world we all live in, and we make all the decisions. We don't have to make any trade-offs. But that's not true at all. In every decisions we're making, or in most decisions we're making, there is a trade-off involved, and you have to decide which way to go and what trade-offs you're willing to live with and what you're not willing to live with.
Yes, and that's such a critical point, right? It goes back to the first point that you made on why strategies fail is the allocation of resources. And sometimes when we are not decisive in making the allocation of resources appropriate, we end up saying, well, let's put a bit here, let's put a bit there, let's put a bit
Yeah,
there, and you realize that, one that needed everything, you've actually split that in the hope that the three of things will work, but actually all three will fail because you've not resourced them appropriately. And so that goes back to this point that on what you're not choosing to do is equally important on what you're choosing to do. So
that's
yes.
well put, well summarized. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also I think you mentioned a few things already in these sort of 18 months, but it'd be great to get just your insights and maybe a quick recap. Just some of the trends that you've been seeing over these last 18 months. I think you already mentioned the world has accelerated, and there is a lot of talk about how much, 5 years, 7 years, but we all know it has accelerated. But it'd be great to get your sense on what trends that you are seeing already in the market in these last few years.
Yeah, I think I've touched on quite a few of those through this conversation. And the ones that stand out for me are the ones that a lot has been written about, which is number one, the whole advent of more than advent, the really popular use and the pervasive is a better word, pervasive use of technology and using digital techniques to get to your customers. And then if I go from just the world, if I start with the world of your own website and how you cater to your customers, then how do you reach them in the whole world of social media? We didn't have TikTok 8 years ago, right? It's recent, but now it's become such a big phenomenon. And between that and Instagram and Facebook, and there are all these different ways to reach people all over the world. It's not limited to your region. So I think one of the most beautiful things is that people say that globalization is in danger of going away or is being damaged. I personally think actually it's the other way around. I look at Netflix. Netflix is to me the most wonderful example of globalization in the last 2 years. I've been watching some Spanish, series that are I never would have done that without Netflix and without having to stay at home and, searching what's the best way to entertain myself. This is just one example. So in some ways, I think globalization has actually been accelerated. Yes, there are certain supply chains that have been disturbed. I agree, and people are now making sure that they have more resilient supply chains. So that's another trend where a lot of companies had their manufacturing concentrated in China, and I'm not picking on China per se, but take any one country, but a lot of the manufacturing was in China. And now they're clearly realizing that you need at least two or three different sources. So supply chain resiliency is another important concept that has come up to the top. A third one is this whole notion that due to nationalistics and so on, globalization has gone by the way. And I think part of that is true due to nationalistic and other political arenas. But also on the opposite side, I just see that the goods are traveling everywhere. You can sell your product to people in India, to people in Thailand, and to people in Finland. It's like the
Yeah,
world is
it's
there
built.
all. And as
The,
an
the build,
online retailer, I think we should be all delighted that we can access all these different communities. And now we have to figure out what's more important. Is it the teenager living in India or is it the teenager living in Finland? And they have different tastes, they speak different languages. Does that matter? Doesn't it matter? Etc.
no, that's
It's
true. I think it's
truly an exciting world we live in.
true, and I think that's the thing, right? Like it's there's no better time to build or have the ability to build scalable businesses because it is, you can, it is easier to afford certain things on, computing power, being able to build scalable businesses. I think is a fantastic time to do that because the cost of doing that has been reducing. Yes, there's always be challenges, but I think it's fair to say that it's a huge opportunity to be able to capitalize.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are living in some. I know that there are some downside and some horrendous things going on, but on the positive side, it's a very exciting time that we're all living in. And we're seeing all this. It's a social experiment that's taking place all over the world, right? With different countries approaching COVID differently. But at the same time, there are people capitalizing on the opportunities that has this has created.
No, fantastic. Now, look, Ramesh, I think I'm conscious of your time as well, but now thank you so much for being able to share those, those examples, those anecdotes, those points of view, and I think being able to help articulate demystifying strategy for us has been phenomenal. Thank you again for joining us, and really appreciate it.
Avi, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Take care.
Thank you.